June 1st, 1310, at the Place de Grève in Paris. A crowd has been gathering since dawn. The wood is dry, chosen that way on purpose, so the fire will catch quickly. A woman is led to the stake. She does not scream, she does not cry. Witnesses there that day would later say she faced death with a dignity that shook even her executioners. Her name was Marguerite Porete. Her crime? Writing a book. A book called The Mirror of Simple Souls Annihilated. And then, through 18 months of imprisonment, refusing to speak a single word before the tribunal demanding that she renounce it. No proven heresy, no charge of witchcraft, no blood crime, just a silence, and a book she refused to recant. That day, Rome closes a case that had remained open for almost 200 years. The case of women who lived free, without husbands, without convents, without a man above them to approve their every prayer. What was really in that book to justify a stake when, as you're about to hear, several theologians consulted by the church itself found nothing in it to condemn? And what becomes of a text once the ashes have settled and its author has been silenced? Does it vanish for good, or does it keep circulating, nameless, passed from hand to hand in secret? To understand what burned at the Place de Grève, we have to go back almost a century and a half, not to Paris, to Liège, in the Prince Bishopric, on the banks of the Meuse. Morning mist over the river, the bells of a dozen churches answering one another from one neighborhood to the next, the smell of wood smoke mixed with dried fish along the quays. Liège, around 1170, was one of the most densely populated cities in Western Christendom. There, a priest is preaching with a fervor that makes people uneasy. His name is Lambert, and a speech impediment earns him a nickname that will echo through the centuries: Lambert the Stammerer. Several medieval chroniclers say it is from his name that the word would come for generations of women, beguines. Lambert preaches in the vernacular, not in Latin, but in the language of the people, the one women can understand without a man standing between them to translate it. And in that act of preaching itself lies something Rome would never fully forgive: religious speech that bypasses the clerical filter. Around him gather women who fit nowhere in the existing order. Not married, not nuns, not cloistered widows. Women who want to pray, to work, to live devoutly, without taking a vow they can never reclaim. But the name that remains in the records, the one historians cite as the first documented figure of the movement, is not Lambert's. It is that of a woman. Marie Douanier was born around 1177, not far from Nivelles. Married young, she persuaded her husband to live with her in shared chastity, a couple still married in the eyes of the law, but refusing ordinary married life so they could devote themselves together to the sick and to lepers. She later settled near a priory in Orny, where she lived in a cell attached to the church. She fasted. She prayed through entire nights. She had visions her contemporaries considered genuine, so much so that an influential cleric, Jacques de Vitry, became her biographer and her most passionate defender. Jacques de Vitry was no obscure country priest. He would become a cardinal, a papal legate, one of the most influential voices of his age. And it was he who, after Marie Douanier died in 1213, went to plead her case directly before the Pope, so that this female way of life, without perpetual vows, without a fixed monastic rule, might gain some form of recognition. Would a movement born from a sick woman and a captivated cleric survive its founders, or die out with them like so many medieval spiritual experiments forgotten in the dust of diocesan archives. That is why this moment matters, not because it is some simple, pious curiosity, but because it was born in Liège at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries in a very particular demographic context, one that very few documentaries take the time to explain. The Crusades had emptied the Flemish and Rhineland cities of their men. Some never came back. Others returned maimed, ruined, unable to support a household. The result, documented by several demographic studies of the region during this period, was a massive imbalance between the number of women of marriageable age and the number of men available to marry them. War widows, girls without dowries because their fathers had died far away and left no inheritance. Women alone, too many of them, in towns that did not know what to do with them, except force them into marriage, shut them away in convents, or leave them to beg. The beguine movement created a fourth option, neither marriage, nor the cloister, nor the streets. A beguine could live alone or in a small community. She could own property in her own right. She could work, spinning wool, weaving, caring for the sick, teaching the children of merchants, and live off the fruits of her labor, without a dowry and without a husband. She took temporary vows, which could be revoked, and if she wished, she could one day leave the community and marry. Erased from canon law, erased from the recognized religious orders, at first erased from every existing administrative category, and yet very much alive, in the outskirts of Liège, and soon far beyond. But that freedom comes at a price, and an anonymous beguine from the late 12th century knows that price better than anyone. No name of hers has come down to us. Most of the first beguines left none behind. She lives in a hospice near the city walls, shares a weaving workshop with two other women, and prays alone in the morning before the city wakes. She knows one thing, and it never leaves her. A prayer spoken without a priest, an ecstasy experienced without an ecclesiastical witness there to validate it, can be enough to arouse suspicion. The canons of the cathedral chapter pass through her neighborhood regularly. She recognizes their footsteps before she sees them, slower, more measured than the pace of the merchants. The silence of the house, the smell of wet wool that never leaves the workshop, and then suddenly those footsteps on the stairs she wasn't expecting. She puts away her prayer book before she even knows who is knocking. That reflex, to hide before you even know whether there is anything to hide, that is what it means to live with a freedom that no one in authority has yet fully decided to tolerate. Because when Marie de Orny dies in 1213, nothing has been decided yet. The movement could still be crushed in its cradle, like so many female religious experiments before it. Or it could win official protection and grow beyond anything Lambert le Bègue and Jacques de Vitry could have imagined. It is that second path that will open up. A papal bull, a meteoric expansion, tens of thousands of women, soon living under this unprecedented status across Flanders and the Rhineland. And already, at the edges of that expansion, the first theologians are beginning to wonder about what they do not yet fully control. You have just met a nameless beguine in a house in Liège, putting away her prayer book before she even knows who is knocking at her door. A movement born from a sick woman and a cleric, won over by the force of her devotion. A movement that, at the death of Marie de Orny, could have vanished like so many other female religious experiments forgotten in the dust of the archives. It does not vanish. It explodes. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX signed a papal bull titled Gloriam Virginalem. The text was brief, but its impact was enormous. It officially placed the beguines under Rome's protection. Neither a religious order nor an ordinary lay status, something in between, now recognized, validated, and protected by the most powerful institution in the West. That changed everything. A status that was tolerated drew in what a forbidden status would drive away, and what followed in the decades after went far beyond anything Lambert le Bègue or Jacques de Vitry could have imagined. Beguinages sprang up across Flanders, Brabant, and the Rhineland. Not just simple shared houses as in the movement's first century, but true miniature towns, enclosed by walls, with their own church, infirmary, paved streets, and sometimes even a brewery. At their peak, around 1250, some of these beguinages housed several hundred women living under the same rule. Multiply that by the dozens of cities that adopted the model, from Bruges to Cologne, and you get a staggering figure. Tens of thousands of women living under this unprecedented status at a time when no other option like it existed anywhere else in Europe. Their gates closed at nightfall. Their inner courtyards fell silent except for the sound of looms, and the beguinage bell marked out the day on its own rhythm, separate from the neighboring parish. A beguinage functioned almost like a city within a city, with its own internal rules, voted on by the women themselves. But that autonomy had a downside, and it first played out on ground we don't usually associate with mysticism: money. In a cloth-making city like Bruges, a master from the Weavers' Guild complained in a municipal record that the Beguines were selling their cloth more cheaply than the licensed workshops, because they paid no guild tax, no workshop rent, and no workers' wages. They work for nothing, he told the assembled aldermen, because they have nothing to feed but their souls. The aldermen listened, hesitated, and made no ruling. The beguinage had the Pope's protection. The guild held the city's monopoly. Between the two, no one dared make the first move. That kind of tension, tiny on the scale of a municipal ledger, repeated itself in a dozen cloth-making towns at the same time. And without anyone yet realizing it, it was laying the groundwork for a hostility that would very quickly grow beyond questions of cloth and taxes. And this is where we need to pause on one specific story. Not a symbol, a real woman, whose path shows what this status truly meant for those who found refuge in it. She lost her husband in the war. That same year, she lost 2 of her children, taken by an epidemic that swept through Flanders. She had no dowry left, no family left to marry her off again, no roof she could truly call her own. In almost any other part of Europe at that time, her fate would have been sealed: begging in the streets, or total dependence on a brother, a father-in-law, or a convent that would demand a lifelong vow she had no wish to make. She enters a beguinage. She brings the little she has left. There, she finds a loom again, a cell of her own, a community of women who, almost all of them, have lived through a grief much like hers. To lose a husband, lose children, lose a home, and then discover that somewhere there is a place where that loss does not condemn you to vanish. That promise, more than any theological doctrine, explains why the movement grew so quickly. And that same promise would soon become a problem in the eyes of certain theologians. Because inside these communities protected by Rome, sheltered from the constant male gaze, something began to take shape that no one had really anticipated: a spiritual thought of their own. Beguines who wrote. Beguines who describe direct mystical experiences, with no clerical intermediary to approve them line by line. In a cell in a Rhineland beguinage, a woman stays up late, a horn inkwell set before her, a tallow candle sputtering and shrinking too fast for all she still has to write. She is not a nun. She has taken no vow that requires her to answer for her thoughts to an appointed confessor. She dips her pen, hesitates, then goes back to a sentence she has already crossed out twice. A sentence in which she is trying to describe a state where, she says, the soul no longer needs any intermediary to stand before God. She closes her notebook before dawn, slips it beneath a floorboard in her cell, and blows out the candle. A notebook hidden under a floorboard, in a room no man is ever supposed to inspect, that, on the scale of a single woman, contains everything Rome would soon no longer be able to tolerate. If this turning point surprises you as much as it surprised me when I first found it in the archives, a quick like helps me know you're still with me on this case. And tell me in the comments at what point, up to here, the Beguine movement seemed most threatening to the Church. Here's what we know at this stage of the investigation. A tolerated movement. A movement protected by a papal bull. A movement that, at its height, brought together tens of thousands of independent women in the richest cities of Northern Europe. But at the time, no one could yet explain why some of these mystical texts, written by women whom Rome itself had placed under its protection, were starting to look dangerously similar to those of a movement the Inquisition was already hunting down elsewhere. A doctrine known as the heresy of the free spirit. How could a status blessed by a pope in just a few short decades become suspect in the eyes of the very same authority that created it? And above all, what exactly were these women writing that provoked such a dramatic reversal? The first criticisms appeared on the margins, in regional synods and in reports from anxious bishops. Some clerics said that certain beguines claimed to reach such a perfect spiritual state that they no longer needed Mass, confession, or any sacrament at all to remain in a state of grace. A woman who no longer needs the Church in order to speak to God. That, bluntly put, was the accusation beginning to circulate through the corridors of the Rhineland bishoprics. For the moment, it was only one theological rumor among many. In the middle of the 13th century, no one imagined it would one day lead all the way to a stake in the Place de Grève. But in the decades that followed, that rumor would find a name, a face, and above all, a specific text to crystallize it. And what happened next is stranger still than anything you've heard so far. Do you remember that sentence in a cell in a Rhineland beguinage? The soul no longer needs an intermediary to stand before God. A sentence scribbled by candlelight as the candle burned down, hidden beneath a floorboard. That sentence, or one almost word for word like it, I found again decades later, in a manuscript that cost its author her life. But before we get there, I need to show you where this story takes root in France. Because up to this point, everything was happening in Liège, in Flanders, in the Rhineland. And yet the final act unfolds in Paris. In 1264, King Louis IX, the man who would later be known as Saint Louis, founded a royal beguinage in the capital. I went to verify the exact location. It stood in what is now the Marais district, not far from the city walls of the time. A king personally protecting women living outside marriage and outside the cloister. That's how respectable this status still was at that date in the eyes of those in power. A cobbled courtyard, a silent cloister ringed by little individual houses, a royal chapel at the center. The beguinage in Paris looks almost like a monastery, except that none of the women living there has taken vows she couldn't one day take back. One document preserved in the archives stopped me longer than I expected. The report of a visit from the royal chaplain, who had come to make sure the funds granted by the crown were being properly used. He questions a beguine in charge of the infirmary, a woman known only by her role, not by her name. You do not follow any recognized monastic rule, he tells her. So under exactly whose authority do you live? Under the authority of the king who built these walls for us, she replies, and under the authority of God. We did not see any need to go looking for a third. The chaplain records the answer without comment. Nothing in the document suggests that he considered it insolent. But I linger on that sentence because it already contains, in embryo, exactly what Rome would find intolerable 2 generations later. Women answering for themselves without going through a male superior when asked who authorizes them to exist in this way. At that date, I expected to find a movement still at peace. That is not quite what the archives show, because while the King of France is building a beguinage in Paris, a few hundred kilometers away, in the county of Hainaut, a woman is growing up whose name will, 1 generation later, make the very institution that protects this same beguine status tremble. Marguerite Porete. We know very little about her youth. No precise birth date, no portrait, not even a single personal letter that has come down to us. What we do know for certain is that she lived as a beguine in Hainaut, probably in Valenciennes, at the end of the 13th century, and that she wrote a book. The title alone is worth pausing over. The Mirror of Simple Souls Annihilated. A mirror, not a treatise, not a sermon, an object in which the soul is meant to see itself, stripped bare, annihilated, in other words, emptied of all self-will so that it might be completely dissolved into God. The book describes 7 states through which a soul advances until it reaches that total union. And it is the final state, the highest one, that will change everything. A soul that has reached this degree, Porete writes, no longer needs the ordinary virtues or the sacraments or even its own will, because it has, in a sense, become transparent to God. A woman writing that the sacraments can be surpassed. You can already see, I think, why this text was going to be a problem for men whose job was precisely to administer those sacraments. Imagine her for a moment, before any of this erupted. A wooden table in a house in Valenciennes, a set of wax tablets for drafts, then a gathering of parchment leaves for the fair copy. Her fingers are stained with walnut ink up to the 2nd knuckle, the kind of stain that doesn't come off for days, even after washing. A companion, a beguine younger than she is, known only by the name Agnès, in testimony later reported at the trial, sometimes comes to sit beside her in the evening and asks her to read a passage aloud again. "Read the one about the soul that no longer wants anything," Agnès says. "I don't understand how someone can stop wanting and still stay alive." "It isn't about no longer wanting," Porete replies. "It's about no longer wanting anything except what God wants, until there's no difference left between the 2 wills." Agnès is quiet for a moment, then pulls her shawl closed around her shoulders, because evening is falling and the house is no longer heated after Compline. It's a simple answer, almost childlike in the way it's phrased, and that is exactly the sentence, or something very close to it, that Parisian theologians would pick apart word by word a few years later to decide whether it should mean death for the woman who wrote it. The first warning sign came fairly early. Around 1306, a copy of the book was seized in Valenciennes on the orders of the Bishop of Cambrai. It was condemned. It was burned in public, before witnesses, and Porete herself was present, or at least informed within the hour, according to the surviving records. A book burning before its own author, 4 years before she herself would burn in turn at the Place de Grève. I hadn't expected, when I began digging into this case, just how much this first burning would feel like a macabre rehearsal for what was to come. What she does next is, to my mind, what makes this case truly unusual. She does not recant. She does not destroy her other copies. On the contrary, she does something daring for a woman accused of heresy. she sends her text to 3 respected theologians, a Franciscan, a Dominican, and a Cistercian monk, to obtain their learned opinion. All 3 respond, and all 3, each in his own way, approve the text. One of them even goes so far as to write that no ordinary soul could understand this book without long inner labor, but that he himself finds nothing in it to condemn. 3 trained theologians, recognized by the Church, reading the same text the Bishop of Cambrai had just ordered burned, and seeing no heresy in it at all. Here, I think, is one of the most disturbing facts in this entire case. It wasn't the book's content alone that led her to the stake. It was something else, something that had less to do with theology than with authority, with who has the right to decide and who no longer has the right to keep speaking once they've been ordered to stop. Because Porete keeps going. Despite the condemnation in 1306, despite the explicit order forbidding her to copy or circulate her text, she allows copies to keep spreading. Some cross the border into Lorraine. Others remain in quiet circulation in Hainaut. In 1308, she is arrested. This time, on the orders not of a mere diocesan bishop, but of the Inquisitor of France himself. She is taken to Paris, imprisoned, and from that moment on, a silence begins. A silence that will last a year and a half. Summoned before her judges, she refuses to take an oath. She refuses to answer the questions put to her. She even refuses, according to the trial record, to acknowledge the court's authority to judge her. Not a word. For 18 months. A silence that stubborn, in the face of an inquisition with the power of life and death. Honestly, I struggle to find anything else quite that radical in the trials of this period. The trial file, the minutes, the interrogations, the theological opinions gathered for the final sentence, has not disappeared. It was preserved under the direct authority of the man who was then in charge of the Inquisition in France, the Dominican Guillaume de Paris, personal confessor to King Philip the Fair. And in that file, which I'm about to open for you, there is a document that almost no documentary on this case ever mentions. A document that explains, far better than any charge of heresy, why Rome ultimately chose the stake over silence. In this file, preserved under Guillaume de Paris's authority, there is one piece I reread 3 times before I was sure I understood what it was saying, because it completely changes the meaning of this whole affair. Remember, 3 theologians, a Franciscan, a Dominican, and a Cistercian, had read Marguerite Porete's entire book and found nothing in it to condemn. Here is what Guillaume de Paris does once Porete is imprisoned in Paris. And this is where everything changes. He does not have the whole book reviewed again. He has about 15 isolated sentences extracted from the text, stripped from their context, and submits them to an entirely different group of judges, 21 masters of theology from the University of Paris. I tried to imagine that exact moment, the moment when someone chooses from an entire book the only lines the judges are going to see. A notary, whose name appears in the margin of the file with no further detail, is tasked with copying those excerpts onto a separate scroll for the exclusive use of the 21 masters. He works from the dictation of a Dominican friar close to Guillaume de Paris, who tells him which sentences to keep. This one, the friar says, pointing to a passage, and that one, lower down, about the soul no longer needing the virtues. Should I copy the sentence right after it too? The notary asks. The one where she explains what she means by that? No, this one is enough. The notary copies it down, closes his writing case, and rolls up the parchment. Not one of the 21 masters who are about to judge these lines will ever see the next sentence, the one that, in the original book, qualifies and explains what Porete really meant. They will judge a sentence standing alone, torn away from the sentence that completes it. 21 men, reading not a book, but fragments broken off from that book. The result of that consultation, preserved in the official record, is not even unanimous. I checked. Several of the 21 express reservations, judging some of the wording ambiguous rather than openly heretical. It is not a clear-cut verdict. It is a fractured opinion, produced on the basis of quotations cut off from the movement of the whole. The same book, read in full by 3 theologians, nothing to condemn. Read in fragments by 21 others, grounds for suspicion. And yet, in the end, it isn't even that fractured theological opinion that condemns Marguerite Porete to death. Keep listening, because what comes next is, I believe, the true heart of this case. The final sentence does not rest on the content of the book. It rests on something else, on that 18-month silence I mentioned earlier. In the inquisitorial law of the time, refusing to take an oath, refusing to answer, refusing to recognize the authority of the tribunal had a precise name: contumacy. And under the procedures then in force, contumacy amounted to a presumption of guilt. In other words, and I want to stress this because it changes everything, Marguerite Porete was not condemned because 21 theologians proved she was wrong. She was condemned because she refused to speak to men whose right to judge her she did not recognize. Just think for a moment about what that really means. To be judged not for what you said, but for refusing to answer. To be condemned not for a proven offense, but for a silence interpreted as a confession. Hundreds of kilometers from Paris, in a beguinage in Cologne, a woman receives the news in a letter brought by a wool merchant. As she listens, she is still holding the small wooden crucifix she always keeps hanging from her belt, an object she absent-mindedly touches whenever she prays alone in her cell. Her companion, seated across from her, closes the window shutter before she has even finished reading the letter aloud in a low voice. They did not judge her for what she wrote, the companion says. They judged her for saying nothing. Then silence, the other replies, tightening the crucifix in her fist, has become just as dangerous as speech. She puts the letter away in the chest where she keeps her own writings, simple meditations, nothing like a formal treatise. And for the first time in years, she hesitates to read them again when evening comes. That mechanism does not belong only to the 13th century. Anyone who has ever been accused because of their silence, during an interrogation, a meeting, a confrontation where they knew that nothing they said would be heard the way they meant it, knows this exact feeling. The moment when staying silent becomes, in the eyes of the authority facing you, proof in itself. Marguerite Porete is burned alive on June 1st, 1310, at the Place de Grève. You already know that scene. I showed it to you at the very beginning of this investigation. What you may not have known yet is that the sentence that led her there does not, in its actual wording, condemn either a proven heresy or any theological content that had been definitively settled. It condemns a refusal to submit. So here, then, is the answer to the question I asked at the very beginning. What burned at the Place de Grève was not, in the strict legal sense, a book universally recognized as heretical. It was a woman who had dared to live, think, and write without ever asking a man for permission to do so, and who refused, to the very end, to admit that she owed him that. But the story does not end at that stake, and this is where the case takes on a dimension I had not anticipated at all when I began this research. A year and a half after Porete's execution, the Church convenes a general council in Vienne, in the Dauphiné. Pope Clement V presides over the debates there between 1311 and 1312. And among the decrees adopted at that council, there is one that no longer targets one woman in particular, or even one book in particular. It targets the entire beguine way of life, everywhere in Christendom. The text of the decree, and I read it over carefully, does not mention Marguerite Porete. It does not name any specific book. It describes in general terms women who claim to have reached a state of perfection without obeying any approved rule, who discuss the Trinity and the divine essence without theological training, and who live outside any recognized church authority. In other words, autonomous women, financially independent, with no husband and no religious superior to approve their every thought. It is that wording, deliberately broad, that would turn an isolated case into a general suspicion hanging over tens of thousands of women in hundreds of beguinages, from Bruges to Cologne, women who had never even heard of the Mirror of Simple Souls, and who had never written a single heretical thing in their lives. A decree written after the execution of a single woman, but broad enough to threaten, overnight, an entire way of life. And this is exactly where the story becomes stranger than anything I've told you so far. Because in theory, that decree should have wiped the beguine movement off the map in just a few years. That's not what happened. In theory, that decree should have wiped the beguine movement off the map in just a few years. That's not what happened. And the way things actually unfolded took me, I admit, longer to untangle than I expected. After the Council of Vienne, enforcement of the decree varied enormously from one diocese to another. In some regions, entire beguinages were dissolved overnight, their property confiscated, their residents scattered or forced into a recognized convent. Elsewhere, more conciliatory bishops, or Franciscans sympathetic to the movement, secured exemptions. The beguinages survived, but under strict supervision, with a male spiritual director imposed on them, regular inspections, and economic independence now monitored line by line. In the archives of a Rhineland beguinage that had received this kind of exemption, I found the record of one of those inspections, carried out by a canon delegated by the local bishop. He arrives without warning one morning, accompanied by a clerk assigned to keep the record. The mistress of the beguinage, a mature woman responsible for internal discipline, receives him in the common hall without hesitation. "We need to know the exact amount of your cloth sales over the past year," says the canon, "as well as the name of every woman who has received a bequest or an inheritance. Until now, that information has been governed by our own internal rule," she replies. "They now answer to the bishopric. That is the condition for your remaining." She has the records brought in without further argument. The clerk copies them out, column by column, every amount, every name, every transaction, a complete inventory of the community's economic independence, now placed on record in outside hands. It is not a dissolution. It is something more discreet, and to my mind, almost more effective. An autonomy that continues to exist, but no longer quite belongs to the women who practice it. It is in Flanders in the Netherlands that this supervised survival lasts the longest. The great beguinages of Bruges, Ghent, and Amsterdam continue to exist for centuries, changing status, regulations, sometimes even their name, yet preserving, remarkably late, that distinctive architecture of enclosed courtyards and individual houses that sets them apart from any ordinary convent. You have to imagine what it means for a community of women to survive like this, not by resisting head-on, but by yielding just enough ground to go on existing in a form acceptable to the eyes of those now watching over them. In one of these Flemish beguinages, centuries after the Council of Vienne, an elderly woman is still teaching a teenage girl from a poor family nearby the art of bobbin lace, a craft passed down from beguine to beguine for generations, almost without interruption. The wooden bobbins click-clack against the cushion, the linen threads sliding between fingers grown knotted with age, the light falling from a tall window onto the work still unfinished. "Who taught you that the very first time?" the girl asks. "A woman who had learned it from another before her. I do not even know the first one's name." A transmission without a name, without any claimed author, crossing entire centuries of surveillance, partial dissolutions, and imposed rules, and surviving all the same, bobbin by bobbin, hand to hand. That kind of silent continuity, carried by women whose individual names are never remembered, stirs in me a kind of admiration I did not expect when I began this research into a trial and a stake. But while the beguinages survive like this, quietly, under supervision, another kind of survival is unfolding in parallel, far more unexpected: the survival of the book itself. Do you remember my question, right at the beginning of this investigation? What becomes of a text once the ashes have settled and its author has been silenced? I now have the answer, and it surprised even me. The mirror of simple souls destroyed does not disappear. It keeps circulating, but without its author's name, copied anonymously, sometimes attributed to other writers, and sometimes simply passed along as a devotional text of unknown origin. Clergymen, monks, and devout readers in the 14th and 15th centuries copy this text, value it, and spread it, never realizing that they are holding in their hands the very book for which a woman died at the stake. As I was preparing this investigation, I found myself lingering on the exact moment when that anonymity came to an end. A library room in Rome, tables covered with mystical manuscripts from several countries, an Italian researcher bent for hours over pages she compares one by one. Romana Guarnieri has been working for months on medieval mystical movements when an anonymous text, simply titled "The Mirror of Simple Souls," catches her attention because of a turn of phrase and vaguely reminds her of a quotation she had read somewhere else. She pulls from her case a transcription of the fragments condemned at Marguerite Porete's trial, which she had consulted for an entirely different project. She places the two texts side by side on the table. Line by line, the sentences answer each other almost word for word. She remains still for a long moment, her hands resting flat on the two sheets, before getting up to go and verify one last time the source of the anonymous manuscript. In 1946, that comparison became a published certainty. The text that entire generations of clergymen had read, copied, and admired, never suspecting its origin, was exactly the one for which its author had been burned alive 6 centuries earlier. Rome had erased the name. It had never managed to erase the text. I do not know whether there is a more complete mechanism of control than that anywhere in medieval history. To erase a woman down to her very name, while allowing her thought to go on circulating in other hands, unknown to everyone, including those who are protecting it without realizing it. This double story of the beguinages surviving under supervision and of a book surviving without a name sketches, I think, a broader pattern than this case alone. A way of life built on the economic autonomy of a group of women is almost never banned outright all at once. It is regulated, watched, and placed under gradual control until what made it unsettling fades away, without any law ever needing to declare it illegal. That mechanism isn't just about those women in that era. Whenever a community born out of economic necessity, here a surplus of single women after the Crusades, gains recognition, and then sees that recognition gradually made conditional on ever tighter supervision, the same pattern appears. Tolerance, then regulation, then a slow dilution until the original autonomy is nothing more than an administrative memory. The Beguine movement did not suddenly die out after the Council of Vienne. It narrowed century after century until only a few beguinages remained, then a few dozen women, then so few that one day they could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The Beguine movement did not suddenly die out after the Council of Vienne. It narrowed century after century until only a few beguinages remained, then a few dozen women, then so few that one day they could be counted on the fingers of one hand. At first, I assumed this decline had a clear endpoint somewhere in the 19th or 20th century. That isn't what the records show. The last living trace of this movement reaches far beyond what I imagined when I first opened this file. Before we get there, let's go back over what this investigation has revealed, step by step. A stammering priest from Liège preaches in the vernacular to a surplus population of women, widows or women left without dowries after the Crusades, and offers them a third path between marriage and the cloister. An ailing woman and her biographer persuade Rome to officially protect this way of life, until a pope signs a bull that turns a few shared houses into tens of thousands of independent lives in the fortified cities of Flanders and the Rhineland. Then, a trial in Paris condemns less a book than a silence, and a council in Vienne turns that isolated case into a general suspicion aimed at an entire way of life, broad enough to threaten, overnight, all those who had never written anything heretical. 3 moments, a carefully constructed tolerance, a turning point drafted in deliberately vague terms, and in between them, a woman burned alive for refusing to admit that she owed an account to men she did not recognize as judges. What I had not anticipated was how long the resistance would last afterward. Despite that decree, despite the dissolutions, despite centuries of episcopal or Franciscan oversight imposed one beguinage at a time, women continued to live under that status until a date that stopped even me when I checked it. The last recognized beguine in the world was named Marcella Pattyn. Deaf since childhood, she entered a Flemish beguinage to find what so many other women had sought there 8 centuries earlier, a place to live a devout life, independently, without relying on a husband or entering a conventional convent. In the final years of her life, a researcher who came to interview her found her sitting by a window in the beguinage of Kortrijk, a rosary looped around her fingers, a notebook of sheet music resting on her lap. Despite her deafness, she had learned to play the harmonium by following the vibrations of the wood beneath her hands. "You don't regret never getting married?" the researcher asks her, speaking slowly so Marcella can read her lips. "Here, I had a life of my own," Marcella replies. "Not a life that was handed to me, a life I chose." She closes her music notebook and looks out toward the inner courtyard, where no other beguine walks anymore between the now silent houses. A woman, the sole heir to a choice first made by the widows of crusaders in Liège 8 centuries earlier, speaks almost the same words those first beguines might have spoken. A chosen life, not one endured. She dies in Kortrijk in April 2013. 8 centuries separate the death of Marcella Pattyn from that of Marie de Ornier, the first beguine attested in written records. 8 centuries during which Rome tolerated, then regulated, then dissolved, then allowed to survive, without ever fully managing to erase what a handful of women in Liège had created at the turn of the 12th century. The movement was never completely extinguished. It simply shrank until it was embodied by a single person. Before closing this file, I wanted to verify one last thing for myself. Whether the records of Marguerite Porete's trial still existed, somewhere beyond the printed transcriptions I've consulted up to that point. A curator at a Paris archive collection confirmed to me in writing that one specific catalog reference still corresponds to the file assembled under the authority of Guillaume de Paris. The interrogation minutes, the divided opinion of the 21 theologians, the sentence for contumacy. No one, he added, has reopened it for a full study in decades. A 700-year-old file, cataloged, located, theoretically accessible to anyone who requests it, and yet almost never consulted. As if forgetting, here too, had become a form of guardianship, more effective than any stake. I'm closing this file with one certainty and one unanswered question. The certainty is this: what burned in the Place de Grève was not proven heresy, but a kind of independence no one had yet decided to tolerate without conditions. The question, though, remains open, because while digging through the archives around this case, I came across the name of another woman in a completely different context, silenced by a method even more summary than a trial. Marguerite Porete was not the only woman Rome silenced, and the next one didn't even get a trial. If this investigation surprised you as much as it surprised me while I was conducting it, a like helps me know this kind of deep dive case file interests you. And if you want to know when I open the file on that woman, subscribe now, because what I found there is even more disturbing than this stake. The file exists. The reference number is known. No one has reopened it.